Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Cameron Murray. Cameron is a co-author of Game of Mates, $20, please buy one over there. An expose of the corruption and dirty deals. There's plenty of those, done behind closed political party doors and government departments. We've all heard about it, and billions of dollars are given away to mates each year, and the mainstream parties are not doing anything about it. We know why. Amongst other things, Cameron has been an expert witness to the CCC inquiry into council corruption. He's been invited by the CCC to speak at the Australian Public Sector Anti-Corruption Conference. He's also spoken to all the major anti-corruption commissions from every state. Please welcome Dr. Cameron Murray to the stage.
Great. Thank you. Okay, take the microphone. I'm going to grab some. All right. How are you all tonight? Thanks for having me. Let me start with a quote. This is the Sydney Morning Herald in late 2015 by Michael Pascoe. The article begins like this. 2 University of Queensland economists published a paper in April that should have brought down state and local governments, sparked a royal commission, and radically changed the Australian housing industry. 5 months later, the paper seems to have been forgotten, and Australia's biggest racket rolls on unchallenged, gaming land rezoning for enormous windfall profits. What I want to do today is tell you a story about how I went from a very naive young economist to someone who wrote a research paper that many journalists think should have brought down state and local governments. And it's a story about learning what we're up against. And I think that's really critical, particularly if people in this room are interested in making political moves. The first question is know your enemy. The first challenge is to know your enemy. And I think I've learned a lot of lessons about how to do that. So where should I start? I've worked in property development for FKP, one of the Queensland property developers, and as a young, energetic economist thought, that's a really great way to try and influence the world for the better. From the inside, these guys build the future. But what I realized quite quickly is that there is very little interest in that whole industry for innovating and building and satisfying customers' needs. The primary job that we had was to cut corners and game land rezoning. We employed particular, well-connected and often related people whose job was to smooth over the government to help us make free money. Do I need this, by the way? Because I have 2. Okay. So I left that. I was disillusioned and thought maybe I should do something better with my time. I thought I'd go back to university and study and save the planet, and did some research into how to be a better environmentalist. And I learnt there quite a lot of things. I learnt that, in fact, our individual consumption choices aren't a great way to do it. I thought, that's great, I ride my bike to work every day, I'm helping the environment. Then I did the research, I crunched the numbers and realised I'm actually not. In fact, our individual actions don't add up, they often get cancelled out. So I learned a lot. I actually, at that time, was doing a lot of research into what's known as the rebound effect, and one of the speakers you've had here before, I think Gary Johns is his name, spoke about the health costs of, for example, people's cigarette smoking. And he said that, in fact, if nobody smoked, the healthcare costs would be much higher than they are now. And that's one of those unintended consequences that I was researching at the time, because smokers work their whole life and die younger and faster than others. And about 1/3 of the healthcare budget is to help people die peacefully. Okay, so we spend a lot of money in people's last years. So if you can die quickly and young, that's efficient for everybody else. So I learned a lot, and I really learned how to drop my preconceived ideas. I really did, and I worked in the government for a little while in in DERM, in water planning, and at the QCA, regulating access to rail and a few other things. And I was completely disillusioned. There was a great game of pretense that, oh yeah, we're doing a really good job, guys. And I would sit there and go, well, our main job is this. To do that, we need X, and we don't have X. Is anyone going to talk about that? Right? And there was this big game of pretending to do what we wanted to do, and I couldn't stand it. So I decided I'd be a medical doctor. Of course you do. Luckily, I bumped into Paul Frieders, who's now my co-author of the book Game of Mates, one night at an economic society function, and he convinced me that you can do good things as an economist. And he convinced me to come and do a PhD with him at the University of Queensland, and I'll actually be able to do that sort of digging and learn and understand what's really going on with the political favouritism that I saw in property development, the frustrations I had working in the government trying to achieve the goal we had set ourselves but for some reason didn't have the ability to do. And so I started on this journey about understanding what I thought was corruption. So I started at UQ and I thought, great, corruption, I know what that is. That's clearly, donations are clearly bribes, and if I'm a really smart researcher, what I'll be able to do is get all the information on donations, and I can use my experience in property. I know that there were particular examples. For example, the Urban Land Development Authority, it was a state government body that took powers from councils to rezone land and fast-track and densify development. And I thought, you know what will be really a smart bit of research? If I look at the landowners just inside that line on a map who got rezoned and made a windfall profit, and those landowners just next door or across the road who were outside the line and didn't make a single cent from that decision, but could have made it if that line was drawn slightly differently. And I thought, it's going to be great. I'll get all the landowners' information, I'll get all the political donors, I'll match it up, and the political donors will fall on the inside and those who don't donate will fall on the outside. And of course, nothing. There was absolutely no correlation at all. In fact, what I started seeing in the data was that most of the political donors donate to both sides of politics. In fact, in Australia, 60% of the total donations across state and federal governments come from political donors who donate to both sides of politics equally, 50-50. So if you think there's political competition, you have to explain how this group of political donors seem to want to curry favour with both sides. So that was a failure, but I was learning. And there was something else that triggered me to dig a little bit deeper. There was a character by the name of Paul Eagles. Well, he's not a character, he's a real person. He was the CEO of this statutory body, this Urban Land Development Authority, who's politically appointed to run that agency, and that agency took control and gave out these rezoning favours. I found out that he was a project manager at Lend-Lease just months prior to being appointed. And I realised that in fact Lend-Lease was one of the major landholders that got rezoned in that decision. And I started looking at the board of directors of the ULDA and the senior staff and looking at their biographies in the annual reports. And I realised that what's really going on here is not about donations as a bribe. It's really a phenomenon about building social networks. It's a longer term game of building up alliances and networks of favours and repeatedly trading these favours over time. So then I got really serious. I went to ASIC and I paid thousands of dollars to get all the corporate records of the landowners, all the directors and all the cross-directorships that they had at other companies. I scraped all the information on the Property Council of Australia, the industry group, and the Urban Development Institute of Australia. I scraped all the information from the Integrity Commissioner in Queensland of all the professional lobbyists in Queensland and all of their clients and all their historical clients. And I scraped a database of politicians. It's called the Remember database. It's a database of former state politicians. It's their biography with where they worked and whatnot before and after politics. And I scraped all that information off the internet in various places. And I mapped it all together. I matched all those names and all those relationships. And I ended up with this network structure of over 12,000 entities and 273,000 relationships between them. And I thought maybe that's what's going on here. It's this social structure that can predict what's going on. And so I borrowed some ideas from sociology and I looked at how we could measure who was most connected. And it turns out that's the main predictor of who got rezoned and who missed out. And altogether, those on the inside of the boundary, their land value increased $710 million from that one decision. 410 million went to well-connected landowners right in the heart of this network. And the only other thing that was quite of interest was that if you were a landowner who'd hired a professional lobbyist, you had a 100% success rate at making sure that line on a map went around your land and you got rezoned rather than just missing out. And that's the study that Michael Pascoe was referring to. I gave that, I emailed it to the Planning Minister, I handed it to Peter Wellington, the Speaker of the House, Rob Pyne, and many other members of Parliament in Queensland, and I've been ignored ever since. Jackie Tradd's been bailed up on the radio with Steve Austin in the morning on ABC, and she's completely ignored, said, oh, it's just an academic paper. The LNP wouldn't have done anything for housing affordability. There's no one wants to address this problem. And so I thought, well, that's really interesting. And what's quite amazing is between when that came out and when Michael Pascoe wrote his article, a paper came out from the US using declassified court records from the US Italian mafia from the 1960s. And they did exactly the same thing. They mapped all those relationship networks that they knew from all those court records of who was working for who in the mafia. And guess what predicted which mafia members accumulated the most wealth during their time? The exact same measure that I used in my network of Queensland politicians, lobbyists and landowners that predicted who got the favour and who didn't. So I like to call it the Queensland Mafia now. That's what we're up against. It's definitely not about donations being a bribe for a favour. This is a long-run game of building relationships, a network of IOUs, if you will. That's what we're up against if we want to get any change in this state. So I wanted to go much further than that. I don't want to just document political favouritism. And of course, none of that is corrupt. It's completely legal. The ULDA had all the right statutory laws written for it to give it those powers. Paul Eagles, the CEO, now works for Stockland as an internal lobbyist. Of course, while he was the CEO of ULDA, he rezoned Stockland's land and gave them a gift of tens of millions of dollars as a rough estimate. I mean, this is what's really going on behind the scenes. So I wanted to test, how do we stop this? This is a game of repeated favours, of building loyalty amongst a network of mates. How do we stop it? Now, I could just ask some politicians, hey, I'm a researcher, I want to try this. Can you stop being corrupt for a minute? I want to test my theory. They didn't want to do it. So what I did, I wrote a computer game and I recruited 2,000 university students to come in and play this game against each other, where they could form little alliances, favour their mates, trade favours repeatedly, and in doing so, steal from the rest of the community in that computer game. Now, I thought it would be difficult because, you've got young university students want to do the right thing by everyone, but 84% of the groups that I had through formed a little alliance and stole from the other players. So it's really an innate human behaviour. And what I've since learned is that many of them, when I ask them afterwards, in fact, all of them, I survey them at the end and say, how did you play the game? Was it justified to play like this or like that? They justify their decision. Yeah, it's the right thing to do. Anyone in my position would have done that. And they're also happier about it. You would think they'd feel guilty or sad or something. No, they're really happy because they favoured their mates. What can be better than that? So when you think about, tackling this, you've got to keep in mind there's a mindset that I'm not doing anything wrong. How can I be? It feels good because I'm favouring my mate. This will be important in a minute. So I played this computer game and I thought, well, what can we do? Well, transparency. Every anti-corruption expert says transparency, right? So I got them on iPads And they're in little booths. They're all randomly allocated around a room in a little booth so they can't see each other. And I made them take photos of themselves rather than be a little icon in this game so that you could see, oh, gee, that's Cameron there. He's stealing money off me and this guy with those guys. That's weird. I'm going to go knock his block off in the elevator. I thought, seriously, no one's going to steal real money. Like, it's real money. I spent over $10,000 paying them in cash based on what they earned in this game. So in 50 minutes of playing, you could steal $20 off two people you didn't know by buddying up with your mate. And I thought, no one's going to do that when they can see right there, doing it in front of everyone. They're going to see each other in class. But they didn't. In fact, they formed their little alliances and their loyal group of mates even faster. Because being seen to do a favour in front of others is a much stronger signal of your loyalty than doing it on the quiet. Now, we've got to think about this when it comes to political donations. The only point of a political donation is to be seen to donate, to communicate to the other person, my credit's good, my social credit's good, here's $50,000. If other people can see it and you still give $50,000, that's an even better signal. Not only am I willing to give it to you, I'm willing to give it to you and show the world. Okay? So what could we do that's better? We could anonymise political donations. We could have the Electoral Commission be a central clearinghouse. If you want to donate to a political party, you have to give your money to the Electoral Commission. They deliver that money in random batches each day to each party, and you can go, yeah, no, I donated 50 grand to your party, and you're like, prove it, you know. All the ECQ has just given me some random amount of money each day from a batch of donations from a whole bunch of people. So you lose that ability to signal that I'm loyal by being seen to donate. Something to think about. I also thought, well, rotation policies. If you're a professional accountant, for example, you must be rotated off after 2 years auditing a particular company. And I tried that sort of thing. And in fact, we have that, democracy. Sometimes we get rid of a party and we get someone else in for a little while. That's sort of a random way to substitute the group who have discretionary decisions over our collective wealth with somebody else. And so I implemented that in the game. Not random every single decision, but occasionally just switch it out to someone randomly. Absolutely nothing happened. We just ended up with 2 or 3 groups of loyal mates who would temporarily take control, favour their mates, and then do it again. Nobody was better off as a community. And that's funny if we think back to the political donations and the rotating to the major parties out of power and how we've got this group that donate to both sides equally. They're pretty much favouring most of the same people most of the time. Only occasionally do they switch at the extremes. The only thing that really worked was this, and I think it's really crucial now to how I think about political favouritism. I decreased the size of the favour in the game that people could give by about 90%. In the game it was 25 game dollars and then I switched it down to $3. Okay? Instead of these massive $10 million rezonings, yeah, maybe it's 10,000. Okay, maybe it's 50,000, but it's not really that much. That's the only thing that stopped my groups forming alliances because the payoff from doing so was so little that the effort to coordinate around it wasn't worth it, because sometimes you'd favour them and they're like, oh, why is he doing that? It's only $3. I'll give it to that guy. And nobody even bothered forming their game of mates because the payoff just wasn't worth it. More interestingly, I did that after. I did a number of treatments. I did it in reverse. I started with a lot of money and then I shrunk it. And that didn't stop them. They just kept going even though the payoff was lower. It was better, it was a much more fair distribution of wealth at the end, but it didn't break down those social alliances that had already formed. So what you've got to think about then is if you want to start a new sort of institution, business, government department, central bank, whatever, you need to think about getting things right at the beginning so that people who make the discretionary decisions don't make millionaires out of some. You've got to make sure that they can't give away all this wealth and make some people wealthy. Okay? You've got to cut down that power however you can. How can we do that? Well, one thing you can do, for example, in the case of rezoning, is you can sell those new property rights to increase density rather than give them for free to those selected landholders. Okay, so you buy a single house, the land's worth about $500,000, let's say, and then this government department comes along and says, yes, now you can build a 10-storey building. And now your land might be worth $4.5 million as a development site. You just got given $4 million for nothing. What you can do is sell that right. So in Sao Paulo in Brazil, the city sells rights. They're called certificates of additional construction potential. And if you want to develop a 10-storey building, you go and buy from the community the right to build every extra square metre at monthly auctions that they hold in different districts. They've raised $2 billion in one area of the city in 10 years in Sao Paulo. In the ACT, they just charge you 75% of that value gain when you get your approval. Okay, so the ACT raised about $183 million from that in 2014-15. If we scale that up to Australia, that's $11 billion. That's $11 billion each year that politicians and bureaucrats give to selected landowners when they draw lines on the map and make rezoning decisions. Okay, so we can capture that as a community and make those decisions not so valuable to those private interests, and then hopefully we just end up with technical people making technical decisions, not political people making political decisions about that. So let me think about real life a little bit more. One of the ways in which the game is played, much more than donations, is through working for the businesses and the industry that you regulated after you retire from politics. Okay, so we saw in the case of Paul Eagles, he worked for Lend-Lease beforehand, the government for a number of years, and then Stockland afterwards. Now this is dead set, extremely common, but banned in many countries. Okay, we have a cooling off period for Queensland politicians of 2 years. For 2 years, you cannot be a professional registered lobbyist, which is a very narrow definition, a consultant lobbyist, that's their full-time profession. However, you can work in-house for a company in the industry that you used to regulate. So you can also work for a professional body that is not a lobbyist, like the Property Council or the bankers one that Anna Bligh works for right now. Okay? So what we need to do is think about, well, if what we're trying to stop is this long-term game of forming networks and paying and repaying favours, we need to think about making it difficult for someone to repay a favour. So we should be thinking about extending the scope of those cooling off periods and their application, their time and their scope. Something more like 5 years and something more like any industry involved in anything you are dealing with. We've got former planning ministers sitting on the board of property developers the next week. Campbell Newman was doing consulting work for Springfield Land Development. Terry McEnroth, the former planning minister, sat on the board of David Devine's development company. Hey, this is just the normal way business is done. It's totally legal, but it's costing us billions. So that's the type of thing we need to think about. That was just the start. So I'd done these experiments, I'd written to other academics, and Paul and I decided we need to communicate some of this stuff to the public. We need to write a book, we need to tell other interested people what we've learned. Because as you can tell, I'd come a long way in my understanding of what's going on. And so we started researching other areas to try and put it together. We looked at PPP projects in transport, where governments give guaranteed loans. We looked at the superannuation system, where for some reason the average cost for managing Australia's super funds is 1.2%, yet the average cost in Denmark is 0.2%. That's 1% extra on 2 trillion every single year. That's $20 billion a year. It's $2,000 for every single household in the country on administrative costs for superannuation that for some reason Denmark doesn't have and we do. I have no idea. Okay, so we started digging. We hit a lot of dead ends. We had a lot of information we couldn't buy, we couldn't find. It was protected. But we did our best to expose a whole bunch of different areas in the book. And what we also did is we packaged up all of the lessons we've learned into what I would call the 4 ingredients of a game of mates. And I'll finish by sharing these with you. The first one we call a grey gift, because a grey gift is the currency of grey corruption. Remember, this is not corruption, it's political favouritism. So I call it grey corruption. What's a grey gift? Now, a gift is when I take something that I own and I give it to you as a gift. A grey gift is where I have a position of authority in the community and I take something the community owns and I give it to you as a gift. Every time someone has the discretion on how to allocate the community's resources, there's a potential to favour one person over the other. So that's the first ingredient. Where you have those decisions being made, you're going to end up with networks of mates trying to form around and grab that for themselves. The other analogy I use is that's the honey pot, and where there's honey, you attract flies. They swarm around, they buzz around, they organise around it. So if you don't have that sort of gift, you don't have a game of mates. You just have human beings favouring each other and looking after each other, and that's perfectly fine. But when one of them has the power to give gifts from everybody else, then we have a problem and we need to think about how to do it better. The second ingredient is you need a group. This doesn't happen alone. As I said, I had this network of 12,000 entities, thousands of relationships. Nobody, in Australia, it's very, very rare that people steal from the community themselves. Politicians basically never do it. They almost never do it for their family directly, and those who have are mostly in prison. I'm sure there's a few others who tried it on, but we've got that pretty under control. But when you have a much larger, more group where you can indirectly get those favours back later, it's not 1 for 1, it's 1, 2, 3, then you pay me back and then I pay you, and it just goes on. It's almost impossible to stop. And you need to build this loyal group if you're going to play a game of mates. Now, there's 2 other ingredients. You need signals. You need to know who's in your group, because now you've got this very indirect group that you're trading favours with, and who's out of it. So you need to go to the right school, join the right clubs, go to the right corporate breakfasts and political meetings, dress the right way, use the right language, communicate subtly. And I talk a little bit about covert signalling and ways that you can let others know that, hey, if you favour me, I'm going to play the game. I'm not going to dob you in. Okay? So you need this network of signals to make sure that you're in the game. If I favour you, I know that even if you don't repay me, you'll repay my mates. And they'll see that, and they'll see me favour you, and we'll all be happy. And there's one more thing, which it took me a while to realise, is that if you can see this game for what it is, if the public could see it and point to it every day, it couldn't happen. We would be up in arms. We would be going crazy about this economic theft. So what you need to do is you need to promote myths, stories. You need to cover your tracks with plausible myths that justify what you're doing as being in the interests of the community. So for example, if we don't rezone any land, no one's going to build any houses. We know that's nonsense, because when you rezone land, no one's obliged to build any houses. They can just sell the land to the next guy, and never do they have to build anything. In fact, that case of Lend-Lease and Paul Eagles, they had argued, we desperately need this because we're going to build 20,000 houses, there's a massive housing shortage. And the planners, they sort of bought it. When they reported to their board, in their annual reports and other documents that I had got my hands on, they said, we've secured a planning approval that's going to last us at least 30 years. I'm like, exactly what housing shortage are you going to solve? The 2015 one or the 2045 one? There's clearly, it's not about that, but that's a really useful myth to cover your tracks. Okay, superannuation has theirs as well. PPPs, the government's short of money, but we're basically going to borrow money to lend to the private entity anyway. It's just an accounting trick, it's plausible, but underneath it's just a gift to this particular entity. Okay, so they're the main 4 ingredients, and so if you read the book, you'll get a lot more examples of all those sort of things, and you can see how far I've really come from back when I thought I was going to do great things with just donations or bribes and that would do it, to what is really a subtle, long-term, mafia-like game of organising mates, paying and repaying favours amongst a large group, and ensuring that we communicate with signals to each other about who wants to play, further entrenching this group and our control of these grey gifts for the community. So that's perhaps where I'll end, and maybe take some questions if you'd like, because I hope I've provided you some new and interesting information. Thank you. So I'll right at the back and then the front. First one, yell it out. I'll repeat it if no one can.
So as for letting everyone know about this, right? So getting everyone aware of what's going on and what you've just said. As far as making that happen goes, is it possible for, say, some elected MPs or senators or so on from certain parties which are not supposed to get elected in the eyes of the media, is it possible for them to go out there and make a statement and let that hit news, or is that...
Sure, yeah, they can do it. I mean, Malcolm Roberts read the book. He called me the other day, said I want you to make a submission to my banking inquiry while he still was a senator. I'm happy. Even the Greens have talked about it in Parliament. Everyone has it. Everyone who's frustrated with the really entrenched control of the major parties is reading it. The problem is if they start talking about it, they'll realise that they have a lot of dirt and there are a lot of skeletons in the closet as well. So I think I'm at... It's the optimal response is to ignore it if you've already got some power. But yeah, I'm happy for anyone to talk about it. Sorry, there's a question here.
Have you had people try and shut you down from not publishing the book, accessing information?
Yeah, so...
Yeah, because this is right, and they just do it legally.
Yeah, so the first publisher I had approached happened to be run by a former property developer, and they had far too many questions. So we're professional authors, we have a big audience, we just published it, self-published it. Yeah, there's a little bit of pushback, but the problem is the best response right now is for those in power to ignore it. Because if they push back, I just go, hey, media, look, that person's trying to sue me for defamation or something. That's a nice story. Oh, why are they doing that? Why don't you write about my book? It's going to backfire. I have had journalists try and cover some other stuff I'd been working on that didn't end up getting published, and they'd been threatened with defamation by various entities they've told me not to tell you who they are. So I won't.
Did you run for Sustainable Australia?
So in the...
How'd you go?
I've got 438 votes.
What made you join?
So they'd followed me online. So if everyone heard, there's a party called Sustainable Australia. It's not registered in Queensland. Dick Smith just joined it. And the reason, well, as you can tell, I'm trying to get this message out there and change things and raise awareness. And the political avenue is one avenue to do that. And Sustainable Australia had followed me online for many years, and sort of a lot of their policies had been informed by my writing. So I thought, yeah, that suits. I'd rather go with the minor party that doesn't have these entrenched networks. You can imagine me trying to, for example, join the Labor Party or the LNP and navigate my way up and shift everybody. I'd be just crushed at every turn. But coming from the outside from a minor party, it gave me a little platform to pressure them and say, why aren't they responding? Why aren't they responding? So that's why I did it, yeah. So, yeah.
Did you come across any examples of black power?
What's black power?
And what I mean by that is real organised crime, as in you're going to be shark bait if you keep going.
Look, there's not much difference between this and organised crime. So to keep your group loyal, you've got to threaten them if they try and leave. Okay, this is, as I said, it's exactly the same type of network as a mafia, and it's just done within the scope of the rules we have. I mean, some cynical people might say the government we have is just the biggest organised crime gang. We just all deal with it, right? I have talked to the Triple C. A lot of people in community groups I've talked to think they have some pretty good information, and I've helped them link up with other organisations, but No, not particularly. Remember this, for example, in land rezoning, in superannuation, this is how things are done. Everybody accepts this. There's no need to conduct any criminal activity when all the rules are already written in your favour. So, yeah, no, is the answer. Sorry, up the...
Response from the Australian or the Courier Mail to publish any review of your book or a story or an article? Because I'm sure there's a conflict of interest where the biggest advertisers are property developers.
It will be mentioned in some of those in various articles. It's getting around. It's really penetrating, the journalists, the sort of technical people, anti-corruption experts. They all know who I am. Paul, someone wrote an article in the weekend section of the Courier Mail earlier this year about it. So it's getting around. It's been in Fairfax a lot. It's been, just about everywhere. A little bit.
I like your mafia analogy because they've got prostitution, they've got drugs, they've got alcohol,
gambling,
they've got poker machines.
Yep.
I mean, it's virtually Al Capone, but in Queensland.
I've had people from Europe come and visit, and they're like, "Oh, what's this construction going on? And what's that huge tower in the city? The Tower of Power?" And we're like, "Oh, well, that's the new state government offices, and they're knocking down the old ones to build a new casino next door." And they're just like, "That can happen?" Like, what kind of crazy place is this? You can imagine. They're like, "I don't think that could happen where I'm from." Sell off the public land and give it to casino operators. Build yourself. It's almost, I've suggested maybe, remember the supermarkets, those little vacuum tubes that they'd send the money through? It's almost like they want one across the road from the casino, right? Get as close as possible. Yeah. You had a question, Peter?
I was going to add a point to the gentleman over there who said, that I don't want to sell out the book too much before people have read it. But your mate who you used to collaborate with, Rob.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look what happens when they sort of collaborate.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah, just lost his seat that week.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's like the punishment you get, right? If you're not loyal, you're punished. His boundary was redrawn in Cairns. They put a good candidate. They nailed him. They got rid of him. I mean, they did it within the rules, but ultimately, if you think what's going on is this network of favours, he's just being given the boot for not being loyal. There's a question.
Lots of members of the legal fraternity are in this sort of schemes as well.
Yeah, I mean, lawyers, planners and accountants, that's their bread and butter. If you follow Michael West, the investigative journalist, he used to be at Fairfax, he's independent now. He's looking at a lot of international tax dodging and pointing the finger a lot at the big four accounting firms who make most of their revenue from essentially shipping profits offshore for all the major companies, and all those are essentially the entrenched network of major companies that look after politicians and foster this loyal network in the political class. So yeah, definitely they're in it. The town planners are really interesting. Because accountants have, professional standards. And so it's quite difficult for them, but they do it. Town planners don't. They can lodge a submission for a property developer to go against the town plan in a particular area because there's scope to do that. It's impact assessable. It's essentially judged on its merits. And then they can go and work for the council that's assessing it while it's being assessed and work on it. And that's totally normal. And I've spoken to planners who've just left councils in disgust at this type of rotation that's going on and the control that these well-connected planners have. And their relationship, for example, with the property council and the major developers, it's just like they all work for each other at the end of the day. And we've got this system that relies on them stepping over here on Friday and being honest and objective, while on Thursday they were here lobbying.
I just wondered why they hadn't caught down there. Because he's been up to all sorts of things. He's actually been in court. He's got off with it.
So
we all know he's corrupt. Sullivan from Moreton Bay.
There's
Sullivan.
There are heaps of them.
Sutherland.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Otherwise known as Slitherland.
Yeah. Look, they're all in the game. You have to play the game to stay in, right? If you're not playing the game, you're crushed and kicked out. That's how you know they're a good person.
There's a huge piece of
Pardon? How did they finally get him? Well, with enough time and power, you get lazy and you don't even bother playing within the rules anymore. And they're not going to get him on very much, I think. Like, the Triple C inquiry was an interesting one. If I just pause for a moment. Did anyone follow closely? So this was an inquiry into funding of council elections, political donations. And so they had a whole bunch of councillors come in and go, so quite literally, yeah, so we just had dinner and he just, picked $50,000 out of his coat and gave it to me. And yeah, isn't that what happens? And they ask then the donor, we call it donor to be, fit their language, the briber, donor, says that, and they've got him on the stand, and they're like, so did you have to go to the bank? Did you ask for a receipt? Did you say this is a donation to your campaign? They're like, no, I just had it in my pocket and just gave it. I wouldn't do that. And yet, no penalties for anyone so far involved with that inquiry. And now if we think back to the whole idea of transparency and signals and being seen by others to give a favour, think about the mafia analogy again. You've just been dragged through courts, stood up on the stand and kept your mouth shut. That's a really good signal of how loyal you're going to be in the future. So all these guys that got dragged through, kept their mouths shut, mostly, okay, didn't get penalised, are now even more loyal to each other than they were before. Okay, that's the net result of that. No penalties, and now they've just proven themselves to be trustworthy under pressure when the heat's on. So there was a question here.
Presumably these riots are going on in countries throughout the world.
Yeah.
Would you say that Australia, for its size, is worse than most countries, or?
It's probably middle of the road for developed countries. I don't think it's anywhere near the top. What we're seeing in Australia is the net result of this is a huge upward redistribution of wealth to a really small politically connected class. And if we measure how fast that's happening, it's happening much faster here than many countries. It's happening everywhere. It's happening more in the US, but it's happening quite fast here. And so I think it's going to keep going like that, and it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better.
Have you looked at the God clause in Queensland legislation?
No, what's that?
When Goss came to power in '89, they rewrote every act of parliament that the government administers. And they wrote into it a God clause, which conveys the power of God onto either the minister or the public servant, in that at the stroke of a pen they can say yes, no, whatever the law is out, you can do this or you can't do that.
I haven't looked into it at all. I will. I've not heard it be used either. But they don't need to use these tricky, controversial things. They just use the mundane, day-to-day amendments to regulations. In many cases, it doesn't come back through the parliament. It's just a regulation. The bureaucrats are involved, etc. Sorry, there was the guy up the back again. We'll come back.
I was just wondering, with regard to what this guy said, how much interaction is there with all of this to international bodies and individuals and all the rest? Does it go?
Yeah, I mean, this is the default. This is how politics works everywhere.
So it's isolated in Australia. It goes on everywhere.
It goes on everywhere, and no, it's becoming less isolated. It's definitely merging internationally with this corporate tax evasion, with the international players in agriculture, mining, property, etc. Okay, they're getting in on it. So here's the interesting thing, right? So there's a lot of concern about Chinese property developers right now. Okay, they're the biggest political donors. But you've got to remember, the reason that they're the biggest donors is not because they're getting the biggest favours, it's because they're not in the game yet, they're not made men. They've got to signal their trust, they've got to try and earn it from outside. So there's a game going on, they're trying to pay their ticket to enter it. And so they're pulling out the big bucks, right? Because they don't have a reputation yet, okay? So you can think about that. The biggest donors are often those who aren't getting the most favours, but trying to build up, become more connected and more trusted in the network.
Very quickly, so if we actually had some effective effort to try to change this here, we can expect to have to fight on an international level, especially against, say, the Chinese by that time. Say we got something together right now.
Sure, yep. I mean, not against the whole of China, but of course, the locally interested companies, of which there just are a few. I mean, it's mostly in Australia, foreign ownership is mostly British and American, but yeah, I mean, they're large companies, Japanese a little bit in mining, they're not going to be happy with redistributing what they've already, think is on their bottom line based on historical favours. Sorry, you had a question there?
In your discussions with the CCC, have you found delay is a key factor when they can't prosecute people?
No.
I had a lot of discussions with somebody in the Palmerston electorate.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay, so there's a huge... it's almost like you've designed... Like we have this anti-corruption system that's been designed to look good but not do anything. Okay, so we've got these statutory limits on events, so that by the time you collect the evidence, you might not be able to prosecute. The other one is that if you've already left council or the government, you're none of those things apply to you anymore, so you can do whatever you like. And there was actually an interesting case someone told me at a meeting up in the Sunshine Coast. A councillor, there was a protected wetland area, and someone had tried to develop it, and they're like, no, and they sold the site to a relative of that councillor. They made the same application. They go, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, the community was up in arms. They went to the CCC. The CCC first asked the council to check on it. Like, hang on a minute, we'll check on ourselves. We're doing a good job. Thanks very much. Went back to the CCC. By that time, the guy was out of council, and they're like, well, he's not a councillor. That's not really our problem anymore. I'm serious. This is what happens.
Suddenly, the CCC has no jurisdiction over
that's right.
corruption of it.
Yeah, so that's right. And that's part of the fight Rob Pine was having about boosting up the CCC, giving it more powers. And one of the other powers it needs is to initiate its own investigations. So at the moment, you almost have to do the investigation for them and go, yeah, there's really a case. They won't take a complaint and start investigating silently or quietly and see if there is a genuine complaint. There's sort of this really high bar to start an investigation. We need to get that lower and have them probing and just checking on people, because otherwise it's not really a threat at all. Yeah.
Found a case recently in Jimboomba. The Jimboomba Council wants to develop 15,000 properties at 1,000 square metres, and the state government took them to the land court and said the blocks have to be 350 square metres. Okay, and they took them to court, the council, and the state government won. So these 15,000 blocks are going to be 350 square metres in Jimboomba, 40 kilometres out of the city, and they took them to court. And I'm wondering how much of all this corruption is related to the cost of housing and land. I mean, houses haven't gone up that much to build, but the land's phenomenal.
Look, it's not tightly related to the cost of housing, because it's really a distributional question, whether the landowner who's speculating and gaming the political system for the favour gets it, or whether we all get it. I mean, it's $2 billion a year that's gone to that landowner. It's already in the cost of housing, but this well-connected property developer got it. And it's just a matter of whether we should be handing it out or keeping it. I mean, that's 18% of the state's own tax revenue. They can drop a lot of other taxes across the state by instead of charging for the stuff they give away for free to their mates. So that's my attitude. It's not particularly related to the cost of housing. Yep.
Has your life or the professor's life ever been threatened?
No.
Explicitly or otherwise? No, seriously.
I know. It hasn't. I mean, this is the thing. They haven't done anything illegal. They've got these great myths to cover their track, and they can just call me a crazy academic. Right? They don't really need to. Their best response is to ignore me. I mean, if they did that, it would be the greatest news story ever. People would go, what's he on about? Oh, look at that. I mean, it might be too late, but I think it's best to keep it quiet. I definitely know, some journalists reporting other things I've done have their publishers gone soft on threats of defamation, and there's definitely been politicians directly call journalists and tell them to stop asking questions.
So is the answer investigative journalists, independent investigative journalists?
Yeah, that's a really good help. If you look at the success of some of the Four Corners stories recently, Michael West now is independent and self-funded online. They really do bring to the attention of some of the good guys who somehow slipped into politics by accident, who can actually do things. So yeah, I think there is a huge role for that. But we know all this is going on. The question is, how do we organise to stop it? We need to, I think, focus clearly on particular set issues. All right, there's $20 billion a year being wasted to pad the pockets of the executives in superannuation industry. How are we going to get that back? There's $11 billion in the rezoning game. What system can we get to share that with the community? And I think we need to all get together and push the same way. And there's a bunch of ideas in the book about that. But I think just saying, oh, it's really bad, we want to break down the mafia, you're going to end up with a new mafia. You just don't want to give them big grey gifts. You want to give them little ones so that we all get them back. I think that's the solution, because there's no country that's perfect and has perfect administrators and politicians that listen to their community. I mean, these don't exist. But there are countries where politicians don't have a huge amount of power, okay, where their giveaways aren't worth much, where there's a lot of competition over those economic rents, so to speak. So, yeah, I think that's where we should be aiming. You had a question?
Yeah.
We're done.
Just a reasonably quick one. And it reminded me of what you said during the talk. Is it a 2-year transition you mentioned between being in politics and supposedly getting onto one of these lobby boards or property development boards?
No.
2 years or?
It's 2 years, and it's only if you become a professional consultant lobbyist that needs to register with the Integrity Commissioner. Now, there aren't many of them.
Right.
Okay? It's 0 hours if you want to work internally for a property developer or a bank or whatever, or an industry group. So it's actually very, very narrow.
I'm thinking of a particular former Deputy Premier and Treasurer to BT, some people would know the name, who went into property development shortly afterwards, initials are Terry McEnroth.
Yeah.
And he ended up being, just last year, appointed by Palaszczuk to Q Super as a chairman. So he's been around and about, and favours were repaid in full at the end.
His name's in my book.
What else?
Sorry, one more.
As a story, like, I'm looking for the aggrieved party here. Because if somebody's hurting out the other side of this thing, there's probably looking for the actual antagonist that actually comes through and says, hey, this person's really missing out because of this mafia activity. All right? And that person, is there an identification of those people that are actually hurting because of this decision?
Yeah.
Provide some sort of evidence towards your laws.
Yeah, so this is really tricky, right? Because in a lot of industries, if you look at industry by industry, there's particular winners in this industry and a lot of losers. But everybody's in some industry, right? So if I'm a pharmacist and I benefit from a whole bunch of pharmacy regulations that don't exist anywhere else in the world, then I might think it's okay, right? I benefit from that. But when I get my mortgage or pay my superannuation, I then pay as well. I lose when I'm in that business. So there's a whole bunch of people who benefit sometimes in their industry and lose other times. And just the net effect is this upward redistribution of wealth and a great inbuilt unfairness into it.
The pain points to drill down on.
I think when people get a lot of pain, individuals, then we'll see a lot of action. At the moment, it's stuff nobody even knows they could have had. Right? That's the problem. You ask your average person, how much does it cost us to have superannuation compared to Denmark? Nothing. Ask an economist, hey, that's $20 billion. It's $2,000 per house.
You sound like you got a person, the system sounds like you've identified 3 cancerous situations.
Yeah.
Feeling the pain, but it's coming down the line somewhere.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's this acceleration of the inequality in Australia that you notice if you come from elsewhere. So my co-author and PhD supervisor is part Dutch, part British, and travels a lot in Europe and Asia, and you can see it when you come from the outside. When you're here, you don't really notice. We're like the boiling frog a little bit. But if we start talking about it now, hopefully we're not cooked before we take action.
Isn't many of the superannuations owned by the unions?
Yeah, I mentioned a lot of them. Yeah, it's a real perverse alignment of union interests against workers in superannuation. Yep, agree.
It just sounds like to me that somebody needs to make a film about it where people can sit on the outside and go,
Yep, so I've got a...
that's affecting us.
If anyone saw the uranium special on SBS, a documentary, anyway, there's a producer of documentaries I'm talking to. We might try and infiltrate some of these industry groups and on the sly for a TV series. Yeah, a little bit. Sorry, one more up the back.
Yes, in regards to unions dominating the industry super funds, I mean, if we can see it, I'm not an economist by trade, but if I can see it, how can other people not see that unions are laundering money through the super funds?
I think people who want to look will find it. There's a really incentive not to look. If you think the Labor Party is going to have a lot of control and you want to be looked after, for example. So this is the thing, right? There's an incentive not to look for problems because then you're immediately cast as an outsider. You've signaled to everyone you don't want to play the game. We don't talk about that. So you have to be a completely disinterested third party who doesn't have a career on the line. When we look back at history, look at Tony Fitzgerald trying to uncover corruption, destroyed his career essentially. Okay, so that's what happens, right? So what we've got to think about is this is going to be there. There's going to be this control of the system. We've got to make sure though we get a better share of it.
Besides forming a political party, how else we don't have an upper house in Queensland. So how else can you, besides the journalists, the independent, how do you take them on?
I don't know, has anyone diffused a mafia before? We had someone from the FBI at the anti-corruption conference and they didn't seem to know either.
I personally think a lobby group.
Yeah.
We need our own get-up.
Yeah, I think... Yeah, so the think tanks and lobby groups are surprisingly powerful in Australia right now. And if you can organise something, you'll get a lot of airtime about issues without having to do too much work. I think there's a high payoff from doing that. And you can control the debate and force people to respond to your points.
How can the right organise a get-up? So you've got Corey Bernardi, Pauline Anson,
I don't know.
Jackie Lambie,
you just got to get professional, get some money, hire someone who's got experience organising new types of marketing.
The key word is the money. You need the money.
Yeah.
There's millions.
Yeah.
Labor put 21 million into this last election.
Yeah. I know.
And we're paying for it. It'll all come with the taxpayers to pay for it.
Yeah, I know. Let's not, just don't think too much. But sometimes you just have to let it go. Okay, I'll try and leave you on a positive. Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. We might have this massive upward redistribution to this politically connected class of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, but guess what? We're still pretty bloody wealthy. Okay, so if anyone can organise, if any country can organise before things really go downhill, I think Australia's the place that can happen. Okay, I don't think it's too difficult. I actually think the right and the left have a lot in common in this particular issue. I think this is something that can bring a broad spectrum of people together. I mean, Get Up has read my book and they might promote it in one of their campaigns.
Because they love it, this sort of
because it's... Yeah, and I guess the thing is, you've got to find what you agree on in common. Okay, so for example, it's not about less government or more government. It's about effective institutions that get results we want. And sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less. And I think there's a lot of common ground on both sides. And I don't know if anyone knows anyone from Get Up and wants to talk to them, or not Get Up so much, but other groups. I know there's a There's an economic think tank in Queensland, Australia Institute of Progress, Australia Institute of
Yeah, Australia.
something.
Graham
Young, yeah, I don't know, but you know they're starting that down that line. But there's you've got to realise in the anti-corruption battle, in the getting a fair share for the community battle, pretty much everyone on the outside of the connected class is an ally. So I wouldn't be upset about approaching anyone who's interested in this space and trying to just push a single agenda, break down political favouritism. Yeah, I think it'd be really effective. Yeah. If there's no more questions, maybe I'll just say thank you again for having me. This was actually a really great discussion.